Welcome to Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast brought to you by STS Education. We strive to be the bridge that connects communities of educators so that they can fulfill the promise of learning through technology. Join us every other week as we connect with education leaders who share their deep experience with the education and technology topics you are grappling with in your own schools and districts. Each interview is designed to bring you tangible ideas you can start using tomorrow. I'm Alex Inman, the founder of Educational Collaborators.
And I'm Bob Cerruti, founder of the EdTech Group. Welcome to the show. Well, Alex, you could tell by my facial expression I was thrown off by this because I don't get to talk first or last or in the middle in our conversations. But today we're going to talk to Bart Epstein, and this happens to be a very timely conversation for me. It's springtime, and in my role at EdTech, I still serve as the CTO or Director of Technology for a number of our schools. And I was in a cabinet meeting this morning in which we had building administrators and the superintendent and the treasurer, because these things have to be paid for. And we're having a discussion on assessment platforms for the coming year and changes that may be made, shortcomings, whatever. But it's all based on this little tiny group, 5 or 6 very smart people, very dedicated, great educators, but they're in this vacuum. And Bart has got all of this experience in gathering this data. And I know, Bart, that's what I'm looking forward to this conversation so I can take it back to these schools in these real world situations. How about you?
It's the whole reason I wanted to have Bart on the show. I advocated to have him as a guest because the EdTech Evidence Exchange is sort of a crowdsourced approach to gather evidence and data on what makes different EdTech software products work in different schools. And we spend a lot of money and a lot of time on making these decisions. And I don't think we're all operating with a full set of data. And I think that's what Bart's trying to do. So let's get into this. This could be fun.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And thanks for joining another episode of Learning Through Technology podcast. We have another spectacular show for you today. Today, we have Bart Epstein, who is the CEO of Brains in Motion Education and the former president and CEO of the EdTech Evidence Exchange. Bart, it is such an honor to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you and I have known each other for quite a few years, actually, but take a moment to just kind of introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Sure. I'm a lifelong educator and entrepreneur. I started my career as an instructor for the Princeton Review, and they were my first employer out of college. I spent years helping to build that company by traveling around the country, opening Princeton Review offices in a dozen college towns. Went on to spend a decade helping to build and run the world's first, largest, and best online tutoring company called tutor.com. I launched and ran the University of Virginia School of Education's EdTech Accelerator and Venture Fund, and hosted the first ever EdTech Efficacy Research Academic Symposium, which led to the creation of the nonprofit EdTech Evidence Exchange that I ran until recently handing it over to new leaders as I moved on to found my new company.
Pretty impressive background.
Alex, I think we need to stop podcasting and go to work. It seems like we have a lot of ground to make up here.
I feel very, very lazy.
Right, to catch up with Bart and all his accomplishments. So, Bart, why don't you tell us a bit about how you've got into education itself? Most of us don't aspire to a career in educational entrepreneurship.
That's a really good question that leads to a potential discussion about purpose and inertia and how most people wind up in their jobs. When I was in high school, my high school ran out of math classes for me to take, which was less a reflection of my excellence and more a reflection of the high school's limited ability to attract advanced math teachers. And I was given the Princeton Review book actually to work from. And so I spent several months just studying for the SAT, and my score went way up. And when I was in college, I got a part-time job teaching for the Princeton Review because I knew it so well. And I loved it, and I was really good at it. And I really wanted to give kids an opportunity to have the types of experience that I did. And that just led to one opportunity after another to do more fun things in education. So I didn't plan to do it. I started it, explored it, was pretty good at it, and connected with a lot of brilliant, hardworking, dedicated people along the way.
Wow. And your entire journey is sort of like you started with entrepreneurship, right? Like starting to train people on the SAT, and it just sort of continued and spiraled. And that's really fascinating that you've had that sort of genuine career. One of those jumps, though, is kind of, in the old, I don't know if it was Sesame Street or Electric Company, one of these things is not like the other. You talk about all of the entrepreneurship opportunities. And then in the middle of that is that EdTech Evidence Exchange, that nonprofit that sort of sits in there. Tell us a little bit about that hop from some of the other sort of product oriented sort of solutions to more of a nonprofit service solution.
Sure. So I feel very, very strongly that every child deserves a fantastic education and a chance at a great life. And ever since I was young, I wanted to understand how could the richest country in the history of the world have so much poverty? And when I was in college, I actually created my own major, much to my parents' frustration, called poverty and discrimination.
Wait, as an undergrad, you created your own undergraduate degree?
I did.
Where did you go to school that let you do that first?
Well, I got special permission from the trustees of the State University of New York at Binghamton to have the chair of the political science department oversee my effort to combine economics, econometrics, sociology, history, statistics, and field research to try to understand what's going on and why. And it was both fascinating and a bit depressing, which is a theme that I think we'll see more of in this interview, because we're not trying the hardest we can as a country. A lot of what we do is simply political maneuvering and power and who has authority, and how we allocate resources in a lot of ways has to do with how our country evolved and where the money was and all of the issues related to desegregation and cities and local funding models for schools and school boards. And this stuff all laid the foundation for a highly fragmented education system that we're all living in right now and has a lot of collective action problems that are really serious and hard to overcome.
So I pulled you off of the path on that, but now get back to how that inspired your sort of move to the EdTech Evidence Exchange.
So when I was running the UVA EdTech Accelerator,
Help our audience understand that. So that was sort of like an accelerator or like a seed fund, right? Like an investment sort of support system for EdTech companies.
yes. So the Jefferson Education Accelerator was a program designed to help growth stage education companies grow faster, in part by doing real efficacy research to demonstrate that their products were superior to the big brand junk that was dominating in the marketplace due to their exceptional marketing and branding powers. And we offered help setting up pilot programs and consulting and help with fundraising. And we helped entrepreneurs understand how to do research. And what kept happening, Alex, was entrepreneurs would say to me, Bart, what's the bare amount of research I have to agree to do for you to give me your stamp of approval and introduce me to your network of colleagues throughout the K-12 school system? They didn't want to do research in large part because it didn't have a good ROI. In general, it was more effective to hire several former school superintendents, a new marketing director, a social media person, go to 5 conferences, build up leads than it was to spend an equal amount of money doing real efficacy research to prove that your products do what they say. So as we were doing that work, we were very successful in finding and supporting companies. And we made a lot of investments that were very financially successful. But I was very frustrated that the research didn't seem to be moving the needle. So I recruited several hundred leading investors, entrepreneurs, researchers, district leaders, government officials, philanthropists, and convinced them to spend a year together in a project where we had 10 professional researchers overseeing cross-functional field research groups to investigate who is using efficacy research, how are they using it, what are they saying about it, what are the disconnects between what they say and what they do. And we hosted the first ever EdTech Efficacy Research Academic Symposium. We heard more than 55 presentations over the course of the symposium. And what we learned was that everyone agrees on three things. Number one, we absolutely need to be using evidence of what works, where, why, and how to implement it as we spend more than $50 billion a year on technology for our schools. Number two, we are definitely not doing that. And number three, everyone agreed it's not their fault. And the funny thing, or the sad thing, Alex, is that they're right. It's not the responsibility of individual school superintendents or principals or procurement directors to drive a national demand for evidence. It's not the investors' responsibility. They do what makes them money. And if doing research doesn't make them money, then you can't blame them for putting their money into marketing and branding. And you can't blame the researchers. They research what the funders want to pay for. So we have found ourselves in this situation where decisions are largely being made on the basis of non-evidence factors. And collectively at this symposium, we agreed that changing the system is just nearly impossible. But what we could do to make the problem less acute is gather the information that our schools need. And that was the birth of the EdTech Evidence Exchange. The idea is, I don't know which math product for my English as a second language students is going to be best in my environment. But there's 100,000 schools in the United States. We are running national experiments with all of the different math products being used everywhere. If we could only collect that information and use the tools of AI and machine learning to understand this math product might work wonderful in these districts, but it's not likely to work in my district. So that was the birth of the EdTech Evidence Exchange. The goal was to build a platform and collect data from tens of thousands of educators who would each report on what was working and not working in their specific environments, and to have them describe their environments so that if your environment is just like mine, we are dysfunctional in similar ways. If you found something that works, I would love to know.
K-12 cyber threats are on the rise, and we want to help. Elevate your school's safety with our free cybersecurity checklist. It's your first line of defense, and we're arming you with the top 10 measures to consider when protecting your faculty, staff, and students. Check the show notes for the link to download.
What kind of participation did you get in that program?
Well, the first thing that we had to do was understand what are the factors that explain why something works in your school district, but not my school district. Education is a land of anecdotes, and that's not good for making data-driven decisions. If I ask you what vegetables and fruits you grow in your garden, and you tell me you grow bananas and papayas and mangoes, I can't just say to myself, ooh, I like those. I'm going to try to grow them too. They're not going to grow where I live. Why? Well, it may have to do with average temperature, the length of the growing season, how much rainfall, the pH in the soil, the nutrients. Every other industry than education has gone through this process and is good at understanding how to implement. But in education, we don't do a good job with that. So we had to create a project called the EdTech Genome Project, where we brought together stakeholders from across the education landscape to review all the research and make collective decisions about what appear to be the 10 most important implementation factors so that we can ask each other to report on them. I'll give you an example. In your school, a particular reading intervention might be extremely successful because you were good at giving your teachers a sense of agency over the decision. You involved them in the selection process. They participated in the pilot program. And as a result, when the program was implemented, they were willing to go through the training. They were willing to persist through difficulties. Meanwhile, in my district, I might say, wow, I have such deep respect for Alex. Everything he does is gold. I'm just going to copy him. And when I choose the exact same program and implement it, it's a failure because my teachers are angry that I didn't listen to them. So implementation agency is one of those factors. And the EdTech Evidence Exchange and the academics involved are still in the process of learning about these factors, trying to tease them out, which combinations of them matter, and quite frankly, to raise the philanthropy and government funding necessary to pay stipends to large numbers of teachers and administrators to get them to report on what's happening in their districts.
Yeah, because it's not like they don't have other things to do.
Well, it's a very good point you make there because this is a collective action problem. A collective action problem is one in which we would all benefit if everybody did something, but we don't have an incentive to do it ourselves. So we all want a free ride. What this means is I would love if every other math teacher in the country would carefully document which math tool they used, how the decision was made, how it performed. But I don't have any individual incentive to take that time to do it myself. So the EdTech Evidence Exchange relies on philanthropy donations to underwrite the cost of stipends to pay teachers and administrators a meaningful, respectful amount of money for an hour or two of their time so we can learn their lessons. But very frustrating that this is all needing to be funded by philanthropy because this is the government's job. If you study collective action problems, you understand that they're never solved by anything other than government. Roads are a classic example. Everyone would like roads to drive on, but no one wants to buy a road making machine and pay for it to pave. You have to have government come together and say, we're going to collect taxes from everybody and then build something for the common good. And one of the problems we have in our system is our federal government doesn't yet feel a sense of ownership over this issue. And as a result, it is not paying for and or requiring the massive amount of data collection and efficacy research that we need done.
So, Bart, it's funny. We have all kinds of research on our interview with you, and we have questions. And then you say something like the politics that get in the way of solving this problem. And I make a big note on my notepad here and I go, that's what I want to talk about for a minute. And then you talk about this challenges of convincing a teacher or an administrator to spend those couple of extra hours to share the information they've got. And in my mind, and maybe I've got this wrong, or maybe I've got it right. If I've got it right, please do tell. If I've got it wrong, be gentle. In my mind, those are tied together. That how do we fix the system? It happens that Alex and I had a little conversation a couple of episodes ago about not directly whether a system is working or not, but whether there needs to be a revolution in education about technology. But I think your conversation is a bit more broad about education in our system altogether. How do you fix the system so that you don't have to rely on donations, philanthropy to fund these teachers? And I hope your answer isn't just more money. I hope it's more involved about people and culture and value of education than more money, because I know everybody gets tired of hearing about we need to spend more money, but maybe that's the answer. That might be it. So what do you got?
All right, I got a lot for you. Some of it you'll like, some of it you'll roll your eyes at. An analogy I like to use is
We're all very used to that, by the way.
There's literally a poster somewhere with me rolling my eyes. So you're spot on. I won't roll my eyes. I want to hear. I want to learn. So I only roll my eyes at Alex. But I've heard more money. I've not heard solutions.
Sure. So Congresswoman Grace Meng and I wrote a piece back in 22 about this issue. And we described the difference between how we approach education technology and drug and vaccine approval. And we'll provide a link in the notes, I'm sure. The long and short of it is vaccine makers have very strong incentives to make sure their vaccines are as safe as possible. They are literally required by the government to do research. They have to prove to an independent third party that it's safe and effective. They have to also recognize as they make drugs and vaccines that if they don't properly disclose the risks of harm and people are harmed, they get sued. They have to maintain insurance. Their insurance company puts pressure on them to do everything as safely as possible. All of those things put pressure on them, and they are selling to a market that deeply values efficacy. Doctors who are looking to prescribe heart medicines want to know which heart medicine is best for which types of patients under which circumstances, because they are accountable. They can get sued if they give the wrong drug. Their patients can go to a different practice. So in addition to all of that, the federal government spends $40 billion a year or so directly funding additional research in medicine field trials. All of those things come together to give us a very safe and effective suite of drugs and vaccines in our country. Meanwhile, in education, we have none of it. No one ever gets sued for having a math program that doesn't teach well enough. Schools don't have to have insurance against that potential risk. It isn't effective to require, and we don't require people to do research before they sell. The three of us could make a new product tomorrow and go out and sell it, and three of us could probably do a good job of it. But it doesn't have to work. It's very hard to know whether things work in education because of all the confounding variables, because of the lack of accountability and reporting. So if we want to make change here, we have three paths. One path is government regulation that requires research. Another path is the government funds the necessary research. And the third path is putting pressure on companies who sell and schools who buy by having investigative journalists report on where things are being used, how effectively they are being uptaken. And each of those paths has its own costs and risks and political consequences.
Are those paths mutually exclusive, or is there interaction between those?
In an ideal world, they are all coming together to simultaneously put pressure on the system. But we have to keep in mind that most things in government are pushed through by people who have an interest in the outcome. And our education systems end users are so diversely diffuse and powerless that it doesn't make sense for any individual family to lobby Congress to have more education research so that 5 years from now, their school might have the better EdTech product. Similarly, it doesn't make sense for an individual school district to lobby or to advocate or to pay for research. And so the best analogy that I have is the National Weather Service. Back in when the telegraph was invented, philanthropy paid for weather equipment to be given to the people operating the first 50 telegraph stations. And for more than a decade, the government was completely uninvolved. And it was eventually the military after the Civil War that recognized the value of understanding the weather, and the Army Signal Corps was created. And then it was 40 years after the weather equipment first was invented that Congress said, we need a national weather service because it's more efficient, because it helps everybody. You don't want New York and Dallas and Chicago to each be operating their own weather satellites. It's not cost effective. That's the situation where we are now. It doesn't make sense for individual states or school districts to do research. But at the same time, we have a nearly ingrained disdain for the federal government when it comes to education. Too many people think the federal government is either a regulator, a meddler, or a regulator who imposes standards. And they don't like that. They want to make local decisions. But what people need to understand is that the federal government needs to play the role of information collector, aggregator, and disseminator. Just like it does for the National Weather Service, we need a National Weather Service for education technology through which the federal government collects feedback from hundreds of thousands of educators, analyzes it, and disseminates it. That's what we need. That's the best way to get the results that we want. The federal government also needs to invest in actually doing the research. And this is the last point I'll make on this topic. If we were running a company that had 1 million employees and we were deciding between 3 products, each costing $1,000 per person, the stakes are really high. We would probably be smart to spend $20 or $30 million evaluating those products, understanding what's necessary to implement them, researching their efficacy with different populations. But now, instead of being one company that has 1 million employees, there's 10,000 different smaller companies. No individual small company is going to spend $10 million to do that research, and it doesn't happen. And the net result is everything is done on the basis of marketing and user experience and branding. And that is where we are currently trapped. We are trapped in the collective action problem.
So, Bart, one, never once rolled my eyes. And I love your example of the research on you wrote it. If you could get a shot of that, Sophia, we'll add them to the poster. You could both roll our eyes at Alex. I loved your example. It's the first time I've heard that example of research for medicine. Of course, one of the big complaints about pharmacy in this country is how expensive it is. And there are people who probably have some argument that it's driven up by the cost of all that assurance of quality. But I think there's something to take out of there. It's not a perfect example, but it's a really good one. What I hear when you're talking, though, is I also know that when it comes to research in the government, a little young for this, but I recall it is there was plenty of research done by companies that said in the 70s, the tobacco companies could tell you that tobacco did not harm anybody. And whether you were Democrat or Republican, if you were from one of those tobacco growing states, you agreed. It didn't matter which side you were on. And you brought up the military as well, which made me think like the military is what gets stuff done. You want to go to the moon? They use, when the military funding comes in, you want to invest in science and technology and engineering and mathematics in the 60s for arms race. The military is your man. You want to get food, kids' lunch. The military is who pushed that for free and reduced lunches. So there's all of these parts that we could bring together. But I wondered, are we just changing like who's making the decision or who's got the incentive? To me, I don't know. Is there a way in which there's a consortium? Like we have all these little companies, my little company, Alex's little company. We bought insurance for health insurance together. We picked from some solutions, but we made our own decision. Maybe I've got this example wrong, but kind of where you're going at with schools, where there are these different choices with real data to go with those solutions. And then they pick what's right for them. So they do maintain their local control, but the data is vetted in some manner. And you're saying that the federal government should be vetting that data or sponsoring that research on those platforms. Did I got that right?
Partially. Let me clarify. We need 2 kinds of research. The first is we need efficacy research. We need to know if your product is properly implemented in a variety of places. Does it work? Does it do what it claims? Do students get better and smarter? That research should not be done by companies. That research should be funded by the government. It should be performed by independent universities and large nonprofit research organizations like WestEd and AIR. And that type of research can only be funded by the government. Separately, we need data. Big difference between data and research. We need data about what's being used where and how it's performing, so that if you decide you want to pick between these 5 products that you think are really good, imagine AI, machine learning, an intelligent platform saying, Bob, tell me all about your school district. Tell me about agency, about your tech environment, professional development, your leadership, your culture, all these other things. And then the system says to you, Bob, program number 1 that you like has a 9% success rate in districts like yours. Program number 2 that you like has an 84% success rate in districts like yours. And then if you can dig into the data to read the feedback written by your peers in Minnesota and Iowa and Florida who are like you can then make your own decision about which product that you want to pick. So the world I'm describing is not one in which the federal government is telling anybody what to do any more than the federal government is deciding what the weather will be in Chicago tomorrow. But if you give the people the data, the local meteorologists can analyze it and they can draw their own conclusions.
Are you dealing with too many broken Chromebooks at your school? It can be tough to keep up. That's where the STS Education and FedEx Fixed Cost Chromebook Repair Program comes in. For $99, we take care of everything: shipping, parts, and labor. This means fewer headaches for you and more consistent learning for your students. To learn more, check out stsed.com/break-fix. So it turns out I understood. I'm just not as good at explaining it as you are.
Okay, now we're on the trolley. We're all here together.
Right.
All right. Well, let me put you on the spot then, Bart. So you've done clearly a lot of thinking about what the industry sort of needs in order to make valuable decisions about a solution. Now you are the CEO of Brains in Motion. So tell our audience a little bit about what Brains in Motion does. And then how have you prepared the research and the analysis for your audience to make intelligent decisions about your solution?
It's a bit ironic that as I am out talking to my former peers who are school superintendents and hearing them ask for evidence, I'm now on the other side of the equation. And I love it. I want them to be making decisions on the basis of evidence of what works. But the reality is, for after school enrichment programs and summer enrichment programs, what schools care about first is reliability. They want to work with companies.
Well, that goes back to your genome question, right? Like, what is the criteria, or the genome project that you did? What is the criteria that they're looking for? So I just want to pull that full circle.
You're exactly right. So if I said my STEM program that teaches scratch coding and how to use AI and how to do digital art, if they have 12% better outcomes than our competitors, that is not one of the top 5 factors that generally leads to a district picking us. What districts care about is, if we say we're going to have 60 instructors show up to the school every day, are we going to have 60 instructors show up to school every day? Are they going to be properly trained? Are they going to have good classroom management skills? If we have Lego robots for Lego programming classes, will we have enough robots? Will they be properly charged every day? Will we have the handouts and the manipulables? We are a logistics and operations company, first and foremost. And in my segment right now, it's more important for me to demonstrate reliability, trustworthiness, and organizational expertise than it is to demonstrate impact. I look forward to that changing and to being able to say we have ESSER tier 2 evidence of our product driving deep impact. But the reality is, BAM, Brains in Motion, is a startup. And there's no way in the world that when we're doing 10 million in annual revenue, that we could afford to spend on the type of gold standard efficacy research that we want to do, especially because we offer more than 20 different classes. So our scratch coding class might be wonderful. And if we do a research showing that it's wonderful, we could put on our website that it's wonderful, but that doesn't mean that our AI program is wonderful. And again, this is where I think the federal government needs to say, once a company gets to a certain revenue dollar or penetration of number of students served, it gets studied. Doesn't matter whether your company wants to get studied or not. We have things in our schools right now that are being used by tens of millions of students that have never been independently studied. That is wrong.
And I think you're in a unique position, right? Because you've had the chance to sort of advise lots of entrepreneurs in the edtech space, then create that genome and that criteria, and then work with EdTech Evidence Exchange to start to gather the data and start to evaluate that. And now you're back with one of those companies. And so you've had a chance to sort of see this from every single lens, which I think has been fascinating. Bart, this is great. One of the things we like to ask all of our guests when we get to close to the end of our episode is, who's your favorite teacher and why?
My favorite teacher was Mr. Adams, my sixth grade teacher. He would constantly be on me for speed and accuracy, finding the right balance. You can't just rush through, but you can't take forever and be plodding. He was a great coach, and he set a wonderful example for how to be a good writer. And I think about him quite often as I educate my own children and try to emulate his style of being supportive and also bringing out intrinsic motivation, which is one of the things we haven't talked about yet that I want to make sure I slip in, because I know that people have questions about how to make EdTech most effective. And student motivation is everything. It's really important to keep in mind that just because we can force kids to do things doesn't mean that we shouldn't build them to be interesting and engaging and something that kids want to do. And my background, all of the programs that I have run over many years have been what I would call student driven. So when I was the general manager of the Department of Defense's online tutoring and homework help program, I didn't have any power to make military kids log in and ask for help with homework. We had to make the experience compelling enough, respectful enough, supportive enough that they would choose to log in and ask an adult to help them with their math or their science homework or writing a paper. And too much of EdTech right now is a forced march through a series of pages because it's implemented by a school, it's required, and those products, in my experience, tend to have less effective outcomes because the students may click through, but they're not motivated, they're not engaged, they're not inspired, and they don't feel a sense of agency, which is arguably the most important thing you can give students.
Yeah. This is where my graduate research is on student individual motivation. And so we could have 12 episodes on that. We could do a season on that.
Mm-hmm. If you haven't talked to Joseph South at ISTE and ASCD, he is doing a lot of work around purpose. And students who feel a sense of purpose, they're more motivated. They work harder. They're more inquisitive. They seek out mentors. They are more exploratory because they want to understand, what would life be like if I was going to be an animatronic engineer who makes self-aware Muppets? They have a reason to be interested in school, and they're not just jumping on TikTok the moment the school day is over.
Awesome. Fantastic. You mentioned a couple of times on there about some resources, and we do ask all of our guests to kind of share some resources and links that we can put into the show notes. And you've mentioned a variety of resources in here, and you can't, or our guests can't, but we can see our producer. And so every time Bart says something really smart and talks about a resource, we see our producer writing all this stuff down. So I know Sophia's already got hefty notes. But Bart, are there any sort of resources you want to point out specifically to our audience that they should take a look at?
Sure. The first pitch I would make is everybody needs to join ISTE, the International Society for Technology in Education. ISTE, as some of you may know, merged with ASCD about 16 months ago. ASCD, of course, is the 75-year-old highly trusted resource for professional development. ISTE and ASCD run EdSurge, which is tremendous research and research to practice information source that does a really good job of taking information from academic journals and bringing it to life. So for those who are more academic, I would recommend the Journal of Education, Technology, and Society and the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education. Also, the Society for Information Technology and Teacher Education called SITE, SITE. And I would also recommend for those who are parents to look for resources for out of school support for kids who should be learning 21st century skills, but aren't getting enough of them in school. And I don't have any particular resources to recommend other than BAM. Of course, we run these great programs, but we're only in a few cities for right now. AI is coming fast, and students need to understand how to use it, how to write prompts, how to create personas, how to outsource the parts of their work that are just rote so that they can focus on the human work of synthesis and analysis and persuasion. And a lot of students are, and a lot of families are paying for private programs to teach that right now. And it's going to create another disparity in our system because parents who can afford to do it are doing it. Meanwhile, schools that should be doing it are not doing it yet.
Bart, I think we're going to have you come back. I'm making a list of the things we're going to talk about to finish our funding and our conversation about where education needs to be changed and what we can do for better outcomes for all students. We're going to talk about AI and how students should be benefiting from it, not hidden from it. It's a tool to be exploited for their benefit. I think there are a lot of topics. And when we start making our laps through guests again, we're going to have a list to cover. And hopefully our audience thinks that it's been as worthwhile as Alex and I do. This has been a great conversation that, as happens from time to time, led us a little far from where we thought we were going to start, but a valuable journey anyway.
It's been wonderful. I would love to come back sometime and talk more. These issues are so important. I can't thank you guys enough for shining a light on them and stirring up the conversation and bringing the right people on. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much, Bart. Oh my God, that was a dense conversation.
I feel like I need a break. I need a nap.
That was so serious and so powerful. And I'm so glad that we had that conversation. But when we were just kind of getting to know one another before we started recording, Bart really is a human like the rest of us, right? Like he's actually really cool. He's his own pilot and he made a PC, his first PC out of notebook paper. Like he's just a normal being. But wow, when we got into these topics, holy moly, this got serious fast.
So this is what I pictured. Like he flies, he's got these superpowers when it comes to education and technology, but he's a regular guy. He's like Superman. He's like an EdTech superhero, right?
We just talked to Clark Kent.
Right. And nobody got to meet Bart's alter ego, the regular guy who flies an airplane, who likes his PCs, who does all kinds of charitable work too, that we found out. So amongst other topics with Bart, we have to have him back for the fun stuff too.
We really do. Actually, I think I was most impressed with the charitable work, and I was disappointed that we didn't get it into the episode. And actually, we need to ask Sophia to see if we can get some of that charitable work into our show notes as well. But what a passionate individual who clearly, boy, Bob, he is in your revolutionize the entire industry camp. Like he is definitely in that camp, my friend.
he was like, sit down, Bob. I'll show you how it's done. I want it. And he's like, you're not even close. This is the way we go. Follow me. And I would. Like, he's got the ideas.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, that was a fun one. My mind is going to be spinning on this episode for hours after this recording. But until next time, my friend, talk to you soon.
I'll see you next time, Alex. Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast, is brought to you by STS Education, a Pacific OneSource company. To learn more about how educators can leverage technology to drive successful educational outcomes, check us out at www.stsed.com. Connect with us by searching for Learning Through Technology in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss an episode. On behalf of the team at STS Education, thanks for joining us.